In June 1919, the leaders of the victorious Allied powers gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to sign a peace treaty that would formally end the First World War. It had taken 6 months of negotiations. It ran to 440 pages. It imposed on Germany the full responsibility for the war, stripped her of territory, dismantled her military, and demanded reparations so large that the final payment would not be made until 2010, 91 years after the treaty was signed. The men who signed it believed they were building a lasting peace. They called it, with genuine optimism, the peace to end all wars. 20 years later, the Second World War began. The connection between those two events, the peace of 1919 and the war of 1939, is one of the most debated questions in modern history. Historians argue about how much the Versailles Treaty caused the rise of Hitler, how much it caused the Great Depression that devastated Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, and how much it simply created the conditions in which catastrophe became possible. But there is one thing almost everyone agrees on. The peace that ended the First World War was, in crucial ways, the wrong peace. And the story of how it became wrong tells you something important about what happens when the people making decisions in moments of historic consequence are operating under pressures that have nothing to do with the problem they are supposed to be solving. By November 1918, when the armistice ended the fighting, Europe was exhausted in a way that is difficult to comprehend from the outside. The First World War had killed somewhere between 17 and 20 million people. It had destroyed the economies of every major combatant nation. It had ended 4 empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian, and created a continent-wide crisis of governance as new nations struggled to form from the wreckage. Entire generations of young men had been lost. The populations of the Allied nations, Britain, France, the United States, and their partners, were in a state of collective trauma. They had been told year after year that the suffering was necessary, that the war would be won, that there would be justice for what had been done. When the war ended, those populations expected that justice to be delivered. This was the context in which the Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919, and this context shaped everything that followed. The treaty was negotiated primarily by 3 men: Woodrow Wilson, the American president, David Lloyd George, the British prime minister, and Georges Clemenceau, the French prime minister. Each of them arrived in Paris with different goals, different constituencies, and different ideas about what a just peace would look like. Wilson was an idealist. He had entered the war late in 1917, partly on the basis of a vision of a new international order, one built on self-determination of peoples, open diplomacy, free trade, and a League of Nations that would resolve future disputes peacefully. His 14 points, announced in January 1918, had given hope to peoples across the world that the peace would be built on principles rather than on revenge. Lloyd George was caught between his own instincts, which were relatively moderate, and the political reality of his country. British public opinion in 1919 was furious. The population had suffered enormously. Politicians who campaigned on making Germany pay won elections. Lloyd George had just won a landslide election on a platform that included demands to squeeze Germany until the pip squeaked. He knew, privately, that excessive punishment of Germany was dangerous. But he also knew what his voters wanted. Clemenceau was the most clear-eyed of the 3. France had suffered more than any other major Allied power. The war had been fought largely on French soil. French casualties had been catastrophic, and France and Germany shared a long border. Clemenceau had lived through 2 German invasions of France in his lifetime, in 1870 and in 1914. His goal was simple, and he stated it plainly. Germany must be weakened so thoroughly that it could never again threaten France. These 3 men, with fundamentally incompatible visions, had 6 months to agree on the terms of a peace for an entire continent. The treaty that emerged was a compromise, which meant that nobody got exactly what they wanted, and the result satisfied almost nobody. Wilson got his League of Nations, but the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty, and America never joined. The institution designed to keep the peace was born without the participation of the world's most powerful emerging nation. Clemenceau got harsh terms imposed on Germany, the notorious Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, assigned full responsibility for the war to Germany and her allies. On the basis of this clause, Germany was required to pay reparations, initially set at a figure so large it was not even announced at the signing, for fear of the reaction. Germany lost 13% of her territory and 10% of her population. She lost all her overseas colonies. Her army was limited to 100,000 men. Her navy was reduced to a token force. She was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. Lloyd George got an outcome that he could present to British voters as justice, but that he privately feared was too harsh. He later wrote that he believed the treaty had sown the seeds of another war within 25 years. He was almost exactly right. In Germany, the reaction to the treaty was one of national humiliation and outrage, and it was not entirely irrational. The Germans had agreed to the armistice partly on the basis of Wilson's 14 points, the promise of a peace based on principles of self-determination and justice rather than on victor's revenge. What they got instead was a treaty that violated several of those principles, imposed enormous burdens on a population that was already starving due to the Allied naval blockade that continued even after the armistice, and assigned them sole guilt for a war that had, in truth, been caused by the failures of every major European power. The phrase that entered German political culture, the Diktat, the dictated peace, captured the sense that Germany had not negotiated the treaty, but had had it imposed by force. This was factually accurate. The German delegation was not invited to negotiate. They were summoned to receive terms. The German government had to choose between signing or resuming a war it had already lost. It signed. But the humiliation of the signing and the terms themselves created a political wound that would take 2 decades to become catastrophic. Historians identify several structural problems with the Versailles settlement that made future conflict more likely. The first was the gap between the severity of the punishment and the capacity to enforce it. Germany was weakened enough to feel humiliated, but not weakened enough to be permanently incapable of recovery. The reparations were so large as to be practically uncollectible. When Germany defaulted in the early 1920s, France occupied the Ruhr industrial region in an attempt to extract payment by force, triggering a crisis that helped destroy the German economy and produced a hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the German middle class. The second was the new map of Europe created by the treaty. The principle of national self-determination, championed by Wilson, was applied inconsistently. Millions of German speakers ended up outside Germany's borders, in the new nations of Czechoslovakia, Poland, and elsewhere. These populations became political tools for anyone who wanted to argue that Germany had been treated unjustly. The third was the absence of Germany from the international order. The League of Nations, which might have provided a mechanism for Germany to re-engage with the international community, excluded Germany at first. When Germany was finally admitted in 1926, the goodwill created was largely undone by the Great Depression that followed 3 years later. The connection between Versailles and Hitler is real, but not simple. The treaty did not cause Hitler. It created conditions: economic instability, national humiliation, a poisoned political culture, a population primed to believe that Germany had been stabbed in the back, in which a demagogue who promised to reverse all of it could find an audience. But many countries suffered economic hardship in the 1920s and 1930s without producing fascism. Germany's path was shaped by many factors beyond the treaty. What the treaty did do was make the German political environment unusually toxic. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government that had to sign the treaty and live with its consequences, was associated from its birth with defeat and humiliation. Every subsequent failure of the Republic, the hyperinflation, the Great Depression, the mass unemployment, was laid at the door of the men who had signed the Diktat. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he promised to tear up Versailles. When he began doing so, rearmament in 1935, remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in 1938, the Allied powers, exhausted and unwilling to repeat the First World War, largely led him. The memory of what the last war had cost made them desperate to believe that each successive demand would be the last. It was not. The men who signed the Treaty of Versailles were not fools. Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau were experienced statesmen who understood the stakes. They were trying in genuinely difficult circumstances to build a peace for a continent that had just destroyed itself. What they could not overcome was the gap between what the moment required and what their political situations allowed. Wilson needed a peace that could pass the American Senate and could not get one. Lloyd George needed a peace that could satisfy a British public burning for revenge, and got one that he privately believed was too harsh. Clemenceau needed a peace that would permanently protect France, and got one that punished Germany without disabling it, the worst of both worlds. The peace they built was not the product of malice. It was the product of a negotiation conducted under enormous political pressure by men with incompatible goals, trying to satisfy publics who had been promised justice and were in no mood for moderation. The result was a settlement that satisfied nobody, that Germany would not accept as legitimate, and that the Allied powers lacked the will to enforce consistently. 20 years later, the world paid the price. Which raises a question that has never gone away. When the people responsible for making decisions of historic consequence are trapped between what the moment requires and what their political situations allow, they tend to make the decisions their situations allow, not the decisions the moment requires. The gap between those two things is where history's worst accidents are made.